Okay, we're going to copy this little figure drawing today. Start by marking sort of where you plan to fit the figure on your page. And think about the head as being about 1/8 of the overall height, because the arms are extended over the head a little bit. And we're going to very lightly block this in. We're just trying to figure out the geometry of this figure. Notice that the shoulders are on a pretty strong tilt like that. The rib cage is tilted like that, with the sternum right about here. Really just try to keep up with me today. We're not going to have time to make a lot of corrections, so do your best to keep up. This is not a masterpiece, but it has a clarity that I like, a great understanding of the figure. We can see how the pelvis is tipped forward, sort of box-like. And if we want to think about the bean idea, the bean in this drawing has a very strong bend like that. If we were thinking about the luminous idea on the head, we might put a circle in here and draw the eye line up near the top of the circle and a center line like that. And notice that the figure's weight is mostly on the leg that's in back, so we're going to do that one first. Sort of connecting down to the ground like a stick figure, planting that foot on the ground. And this is when I might want to check my proportions. I could go from like top of the head to the greater trochanter of the femur and the bottom of this heel. And if I measure, I can see that top half and bottom half are the same. I hope everyone understands my thinking.
Where are those papers, Mr.
Right here. No, they're not. Look at the paper.
Where is that? Oh, wait.
So I hope this geometry makes sense to everyone. I'm going from the bottom of this heel. That little indentation that I'm pointing at right here is the greater trochanter of the femur. That should be sort of around my middle point and top of the head. And I want everybody to do this. You want to measure and make sure you got about the same distance here and here. And you can measure from the screen image the same way, extending your hand out like this and checking your distance. The slightly confusing thing is that the other leg is going to extend down further than that first one. So we're going to just sort of block that in like this. And that heel, I put it a little too far back, sort of. We're trying to keep the feet centered under the head, so it doesn't look like she's tipping over. And finally, we're going to block in the arms like this. And she's holding on, she seems to have something on her head that she's holding on to. And at this stage, without doing any detail, I'm going to create my figure and just make sure the geometry of my drawing corresponds to the basic geometry of this figure. So you can do the same thing very lightly. I'm going to extend this line down here. Notice how the knee kind of hits this line. This angle looks okay. This angle, and then we're dropping down from here to the back of this heel and making sure that the box that I outlined in red kind of corresponds to the forms in your drawing. And that looks okay, so I'm going to pause for a minute while you catch up. If you're doing this at home, just pause the video. Okay, so next thing I'm going to try to do is something that this artist may have screwed up a little, which is the proportions of the face. Does everyone agree this face feels a little too big for the head?
Yeah.
So I may try to do not exactly, well, I don't know, we'll see. I might fix it a little bit. So we're going to zero in on the head now and try to get that eye line on the correct curve. And I'm going to start by doing just what this artist did and just placing a few little shadows. Shadow under the nose, shadow of the upper lip, and shadow under the bottom lip. And see how these little clusters of dark shadow around the eye socket, that's really all it takes to suggest the face and even a little bit of the expression. We're trying to study just the simplicity of this face. There's really not much to it. Please don't start adding a lot of details that aren't there. And I'm going to try to do a close copy, which means as I shade, I'm going to try to follow the shading direction of the original. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Don't just shade it the way you normally do. Try to make your hand do what this artist's hand did. And part of the reason we're going to do that today is because this original drawing does not seem to have much in the way of like a first shading. You see what I mean? It's like almost all the shading lines follow the contours of this figure. I don't know if this is a hat or what, but here's the ear. Notice the ear is below eye level because of the angle that we're looking up at the head at. And here's the back of the head with a little shading like that. And that's pretty much all there is to it with the head. Do not start adding a bunch of details that you can't see, please. Just leave it like that. And as I said, I think I might have made the face just a little smaller for this head, which feels better to me, but if you didn't, that's all right too. Let's see. one of the things I like best about this drawing is how the handling of these contours, it's all slightly exaggerated. It's a little clearer than it would be in real life. Before we start doing this arm, I want you to check and make sure that your negative space is shaped about right. I could create that for you so you can see. Just check your angles, and you should be seeing a shape sort of like this. So check your angles, make sure that that's all about correct before you start thinking about curves. When you hear artists talking about blocking things in, that's what we mean. We think about everything in terms of straight lines and angles, and only when that is correct do we worry about curves. Curves are the fun part. That's what people are usually in a hurry to get to, but they're harder to see, they're harder to measure, so this kind of simplification is really important. I'm going to do that on both sides. You can do the same thing. Make sure those shapes are about right. And I'm going to get rid of these annotations now. And we are thinking about overlapping anatomical features. So here we have a little curve for the collarbone. Here we've got a curve for the deltoid muscle. That overlaps this curve for the bicep. Which overlaps another muscle behind the bicep, which is reading kind of straight. It's a little bridging muscle. And here's the forearm muscles. My wrist is about level with the top of this eyebrow. See that? So, no, I guess it's more like with this eye on the. If I go straight across from this eye, that's where my wrist is, so that's where this curve starts. And here's the rest of the forearm, elbow, and a slight swelling downward of the triceps. There's some very clear shadow mapping going on this arm right along here. And this whole side is in shadow. All the way to the shoulder. And then there's this elegant second shading starting in the armpit and going through the core shadow on the upper arm like this. Maybe a little bit of a core shadow on that part of the arm. Very, very simple construction. So right here is the sternum. Sternum's really important to think about because it kind of shows which direction the whole rib cage is turned. So make sure you at least mark that position. And between this point and this point, we've got an angle that's sort of a little less steep than the angle of the eyes because it's closer to our eye level. So mark that. As you've heard me say before, when you study human anatomy, it really gets confusing in the armpit. It's like the most confusing part. There's so many muscles meeting in that zone, and I don't remember what most of them are called. So we're just gonna try to draw what we see here. This is the pectoralis muscle. And this bulge here corresponds to the shoulder blade and the latissimus dorsi muscle, but I'm not going to try to explain all that because I don't honestly remember. But this is a very elegant demonstration, I think, of the idea that often where a beginner sees a concavity, like right here, the trained artist, as in this original drawing, sees a set of overlapping convexities. You see what's happening here? So try to resist the temptation to draw any of these as concavities and draw them as overlapping convex curves. Another principle that's demonstrated here is that on the figure, usually opposite a concavity on one side, or a depression, you'll see a convexity on the other. But again, you're never going to go to life drawing and see the forms laid out for you this clearly. You're not going to see these little overlaps. They're not going to be this easy to understand, and that's why the training of artists in the past began with literally, a year or two of just doing this sort of copying with little or no original work. So I'm going to quickly shadow map this arm as well. And what's going on with this hand? Sort of the wrist. I'm going to look for where to break the wrist again. Visually, it happens above a point halfway between the ear and the eye, so that's about right. And this finger just curls around behind whatever she's holding on her head. Notice I sort of neglected this little overlap between the bicep on this side and the forearm right here, which helps bring this in front of this. And I think as we move into the torso, it would be, I'll leave this zoomed out so you can see the hands. I think it would be wise to shadow map that, so I'm going to show you the basic shadow map on this drawing. That, and you can just try to draw that shape. On this sort of complex form, it's really a good idea to commit to the shadow edge before you commit to your outside edges, because the first shading is going to show you so much about the form, and it's going to be so much easier to get the form right if you can start to see it in 3 dimensions, which is what the first shading does for you. So this here sort of is an exception to the rule. This really does look like a concavity, but we can still read convex here and convex here. Right inside here there's a series of overlapping sort of straight muscles, which creates a feeling of a concavity though. Here's a convex curve for the upper gluteal muscles, sort of aiming in towards the greater trochanter, and then we've got the lower gluteals and the fat pad under there. Probably a good idea to just lightly indicate not only the sternum, but this is called the linea alba, which is the division of the abdominal muscles, and that's going to lead us to the navel. And I'm going to pause here again to come and check your work. So before we move on to the legs, we're just going to place a few of our highlights. Let me zoom in so we can really see what we're dealing with here. Use really light pressure with these highlights. On the rubric, this correct highlights are going to be important for getting the range of values on the rubric. So some people wait till the whole drawing's done before they put in their highlights, but it helps me to see some of the highlights before I put in my darkest darks. And notice I tried to press light, but I even went a little too bright on my lights, so I'm just going back in with a kneaded eraser, very lightly lifting some of those. But this is a great example of just how much mileage you can get from the gray paper, or the green paper in this case, because just that tiny bit of light really brings the drawing to life and makes the forms so much more legible. Probably the most important area for the highlighting is the way that the white on notice the sternum is not really defined by a dark, it's defined by just a little bit of white on either side of it, and you see how that brings it out. And there's a little bit of light along the right hand side of the linea alba through here. And a little bit of white on the side of the crest of the pelvis over here. And on the rib cage here. I'm going to clean up my shadow map a little bit now. And we're going to do final shading through the torso, which we haven't done yet. And I really want you to pay attention to the shading direction that you see in the original. The expectation with this copy is that you do your best to move your hand exactly the same direction as the artist did. Right here you can see just a little bit of this serration, which are pretty sure those are ribs. And notice again this very clear, beautiful reflected light coming into the back of the rib cage and the shoulder blade. It's not There is some shading there. It's not even as bright as the gray paper. So make sure you've shaded a little bit where the reflected light is, and then you're going to start pressing harder through the core shadow until you start to see that reflective light reading bright enough. And that's how you know that your darks are dark enough. That's the easiest way by far to stay clear about how whether or not you've gone dark enough with your dark values. If your reflected lights are reading, you're going to be in pretty good shape. I want everyone to pay attention to shading direction here on the underside of the belly, and you can see just how mechanical they are. These shading lines are like the latitude and longitude lines on a globe. They curve either this way or this way, but both directions are curving around the form very clearly. And if you can get your hand to do these things, you'll be training your hand to be a better draftsmanship, because these sorts of curved lines, curving around forms, as I've said before, are not natural to anyone. They are purely the product of study and effort. Sort of like fingering the chords on the neck of a guitar. Like, nobody just starts doing that the right way. Okay, we're about to block in the forms of the legs, so I'm going to zoom out again in a second so we can see the whole figure. It's going to be good to relate, though. We haven't really drawn those in at all, so it's going to be good to relate those to the figure as a whole. So I've already found this overlap, which is, remember this line represents the axis through the leg, basically the femur. So we've got a lot of musculature in front of the femur on the thigh. So we're going to carry this pretty high like that. And then we come down to the knee and we have this sort of box-like form. The end of the knee. And this is something that a lot of people don't see right away, but under the kneecap we have this sort of undercut right there, and then we have the front of the shin, the lower leg through that. We also have some musculature on the back of the thigh. And notice that the swollen part of the calf is near the top, and then tapers a lot towards the ankle. Right here is a good opportunity to just look at this as an abstract geometric shape and sort of pop that in there. And this is another kind of negative space showing back here. And this little foot has to fit inside this little corner. Don't get too hung up on the toes today. We're going to just barely indicate them. And I'm going to shadow map this thigh. You can see these sort of indentations in the shadow map where we have overlapping muscle groups. We don't need to worry about what they are as long as you can see that there's something going on here that's clearly indicative of some changes going on under the skin. And under here I can see some first shading going in a right-handed direction, so I'm just going to sort of flip my hand upside down and shade it the wrong way with my left hand. Most of you are right-handed though, and I'll have an easy time laying in this initial shadow. And once again, I'm going to erase my shadow map so I can create soft edges along these shadows, along the terminators of these shadows, like that. I may as well put a little bit of shadow on the ground. Notice the shading on the ground, just like I teach you. So first shading direction, followed by some horizontal shading to show that it's a flat horizontal plane, like that. So we're about to do detail shading on the legs, second shading, but first we're just going to pause for a minute. Now that the big shadow shapes are laid in, the drawing is starting to look pretty finished. So before we commit any darker lines to the lower shading, it's a good time to just sort of check your work for errors. I'm going to pause for a minute while you do that. Okay, we're going to zoom in now and really take a close look at what we're seeing. A couple of you are still having problems because you haven't erased your shadow maps. We don't want this to be a sharp edge. And then we want to do the second shading. Notice the first shading is all flowing this way. The second shading is wrapping around that thigh like this. And always shade from the dark area towards the light, and release your pencil from the paper when it's moving into that light zone. And it really doesn't take much to suggest that form turning into the light through that darker core shadow area. And then I can shade down the other way towards the reflected light and just sort of leave it alone when I get into the reflected light. If you're successful in this drawing, we should be able to see right here, see the way these lines curve in? That's the greater trochanter general location that we were talking about at the beginning. And don't be afraid to press kind of hard when you're going through this core shadow. That's the key to making those forms turn. Go dark enough here, but not too dark where the reflected lights are. There's even a little reflected light at the bottom of the belly, which I didn't really notice before. I'm going to just lighten that a little with my kneaded eraser, and then go a little darker through the core up here. It's very easy to fine-tune these values. You see how I just created a new sense of the reflected light in here? And down here we have a sharply overlapping edge, so we're going to go darker in here along with a few sharpening strokes to bring out that edge. A few more sharpening strokes right here. Remember, a sharpening stroke follows the contour. Here's another one of those beautiful little overlaps that he creates. And you'll also notice, as I've said before, many art teachers will complain about all outlines. Where you've got, on the shadow side of an object, it's an aesthetic choice, but you can go he decided to go pretty dark on his outlines, and I think it looks good. But notice that on the light side of the object, like the top of the belly here, the outline is much fainter and more subtle. That's an important distinction to make. If you start doing dark outlines on the light sides of objects, your drawing's going to look very clumsy. So I'm going to make sure these stay light, but the ones on the shadow side can be relatively dark. You can see how clearly you can read the bone underneath this shading. And then on the calf, very easy again. The second shading is these slightly curved lines that go through the core shadow and wrap around the calf. They get very dark right here. And if you're having trouble with the feet, this is a good time to, I'm going to zoom in for a minute so you can make some corrections. Notice that the toes line up pretty much along a horizontal until they get to this smallest toe. There should be 5 of them. With a little shadow shape right here and some shading for the ankle right here. Now when you put the white in your hand, it's very exciting at first to see how it lights up the form, and you're going to be tempted to put way too much white into your drawing. So let's really take a close look at this and notice that there's really hardly any white on the legs. Mostly just along this surface of the thigh. Tiny bit here and here, and a little bit right here, which really brings out that underside of the belly by contrast. And again, I'm having a difficult time getting my lights to be subtle enough, so I'm just putting them on, and then I'm going to go back and lift some off with my eraser. Okay, time for final touches and final assessment. So I'm going to okay, there we go. Put a little bit of white on these ribs. There's a little white on the coastal arch. At this stage, what we're trying to do is just sort of judge how our light and dark effects are reading overall compared to the original. And for my final touches here, I'm just going to put a few dark accents in the face around the nostrils and the mouth. Eyebrow. Make the ear a little bigger. And go quite a bit darker on the hair behind the neck. Your final touches will probably be different. That was just sort of looking not finished to me.
Can you show more of the legs?
Yep, just give me one sec. Okay, I'm going to close down the video now. It's about as far as I'm going to take this one. Thank you for watching.